religions essentially exist to convert resources into offspring. That's why religions exist, to convert resources into offspring. And they solve a lot. I mean, you quote Sam Harris. I like Sam Harris. I don't love Sam Harris. But on this issue, Sam Harris has been really useful in helping to get the American left on board with at least the most tepid criticisms of Islam. I mean, may we criticize a little bit, please? So I think he's been useful in that sense. But I disagree with a lot of his atheism. In any case, religions exist to convert resources into offspring, and they solve a lot of civilizational problems on the smaller scale that human nature doesn't solve. There's a logic to religions. There's a reason that all around the world religions exist. That's why I'm not crazy about the new atheist guys. I used to be more into them, like Dawkins and Dennett. I'm not as much into them anymore. In particular, what religions solve, and what I read Jonathan Haidt's book recently, The Righteous Mind, which I thought was very elucidating on these topics. And what religions solve is creating cooperation between non-kin, because you'll always have cooperation between kin. But when you broaden it beyond the family, it becomes very difficult to reasonably expect reciprocity. But when you place it within within a religious context, you do start to see it. And they've done many tests where, like these games people will play, trading money back and forth, like in a social scientist scenario. And when you're trading with someone on a computer, you don't see them. You just see a name or whatever. You're playing some cooperative game. It's like a prisoner's dilemma style game, and the invigilator tells you that the person you're trading with is the same religion as you. More trust immediately takes place. You are more trusting and more likely to reach an optimal solution in this, like a Pareto optimal solution in this prisoner's dilemma, when the person is of the same religion as you. And this comes back to what I was talking about with Robert Putnam too, and the decreased social trust that takes place in diverse cities too. I think we need to take this stuff seriously. And then finally, this was one of the most interesting studies that I read in Jonathan Haidt's book. There was this scientist named Richard Sosis who, in the 20th century, who studied the history of communes in the 20th century in the United States, because there was a very active commune movement where people were basically leaving cities and saying, we're going to form our own commune. This is our space. And there were two basic types of communes. There were socialist communes, and there were religious-based communes, whether they were Orthodox Jewish or Christian or some other religion. I'm not sure of the others, but these were the two basic types: religious, socialist. The scientist Richard Sosis looked at these over several decades and found that the probability for any of those communes to exist after 7 or 8 years or so was much, much higher. It was like 34%. I believe it was 34% of the religious communes existed after 20 years, and only 7% of the socialist communes existed after 20 years. That's a pretty scientifically significant difference. And the reason he extrapolated, the reason he attributed this to, was that the religious ones were able to conquer the tragedy of the commons by instilling trust.
And philosophical worldview.
It makes...
That's one what the metaphysical or existential philosophical worldview is in the religious commune and not in the just socialistic commune.
Yes, right. That's right.
Now, do you think we could replace?
Yeah. And
do you think we could replace the notion of an afterlife or the sort of piety of it with coming together under a common banner of humanism and human rights and that sort of fundamental ethical code and morale, rather than an existential what happens after you die sort of approach?
No. The nicest thing I can say about that is that it's idealistic.
I generally I get along with people that don't want to treat women as second-class
That's not
citizens.
my point. Obviously. No, that's not my point. My point is, look at who's going to own the 21st century, and the main competitor is China. In terms of owning this century, in terms of who's going to conquer the world and militarize space and essentially take humanity interstellar and end up mining the moon for energy resources. I mean, this stuff is serious, and get into all kinds of biotechnology and biomimetics. All this stuff is going to empower one civilization or the other. That's why we have all these. So I'll say quickly, like, eugenics, neo-eugenics is totally anathema in the United States. Like, we don't want to touch it at all. Fair enough. Do you ever think about what the Chinese think about it? Because they totally embrace it. China absolutely embraces eugenics, 100%.
Well, again, we have this with eugenics and the Nazi regime. There's a stigma,
that's right.
an ethical
yes,
stigma.
That's correct. But it goes back.
Eugenics
is older than Nazis in Germany too. It's certainly older than that. But my point is today, on civilizational terms, China totally embraces it. So China is in it to win it, essentially. And China's in a greater state of expansion right now. It's just very clear. I was in Africa over the summer. I was in Tanzania and Kenya. And, I've always read about, I started reading about this like 12 years ago in The Economist, about China's economic expansion into Africa and China's plans for like a new Silk Road. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting that China is setting up shop in Africa. And then you go and see it, and then it really hits you, because I was driving around Kenya and Tanzania, and every 15, in certain parts, every 15, 20 minutes or so, you'll see a small bridge being built. You've got two Chinese, I don't know, like foremen or managers or whatever, and then an African staff. And these are all Chinese construction companies building the infrastructure in Africa. And they're going to project their force in a way that serves Chinese interests, not that serves American interests. They're expanding in the South China Sea. All of the 4 Asian tigers, 3 of them are Chinese. And if you look at, I think it was, what's her name? Amy Chua, I think, is the writer who talked about this. She was Tiger Mom. I think her name's Amy Chua. I might be getting that wrong. But she wrote this great book about how, you have Chinese, not just in China. They're all over Southeast Asia as well. They're in Malaysia, especially Indonesia. And the wealth that they bring, they concentrate a lot of wealth among ethnic Han Chinese in those countries as well. So the countries become richer, but it's highly concentrated among this particular ethnic group too. And the Chinese are not thinking in terms of constitutionalism. They're not thinking in terms of our civilization is defined by ideals, and anyone can move to the United States and become an American. To some extent, that's been a tenuous argument. I mean, I'm an example of that. I'll say my parents are from Iran. I was born here and everything, so I have this kind of mishmash of an identity. But I definitely consider myself an American more than anything else. Iran is really important to me as well. But I mean, it has kind of worked a bit in the United States, but that's not China's thinking at all. China's thinking is based on a mirror test, which means you're Chinese if you look in the mirror and you think you're Chinese. So you can't move to Japan and become a Japanese person. You can't move to China and become Chinese. No. You'll always be, an expatriate or a foreigner.
Are you saying that to the Chinese, their ethnicity and culture as Chinese and China as their country is akin to religiosity, and that as a common bond and factor? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they have Confucianism as well, which is totally enmeshed with Chinese identity. Absolutely. I mean, that's a very old civilization too. I mean, it's in that sense, it's got its history like Iran. I mean, they've got 2,000 or 3,000 years of civilization as well. But so I think your proposal, the nicest thing I can say is that it's idealistic, and I think we need to be more realistic about what the future of international relations, what international politics is going to look like. And I think people should take Sam Huntington pretty seriously in Clash of Civilizations. There's a lot that book got very right. That said, I am really optimistic about the future, honestly. I mean, with all this stuff that we're talking about, nevertheless, I am so happy to be alive today. I am so excited for the technological advances and civilizational advances that we're going to see. I mean, we're making huge strides across the board, even on indicators of violence. Like Steven Pinker writes about this in our Better Angels. I mean, we're just. I mean, we did have. I mean, there's problems that need to be fixed. We did have an uptick in civil wars, and most of this has to do with Syria. I mean, Syria was a total fucking tragedy, and still is a tragedy. But by and large, although our technology has advanced so much, and we have the capacity to completely destroy every last human being in the form of nuclear weapons, I'm really hopeful, because despite it, we haven't done it. We made it through the Cold War in a doctrine of mutually assured destruction. You know, of course, there were many deaths along the way, but the trend lines tend to be going downward, and I think we're entering into a world of much greater prosperity. I think there's a lot of priorities that we need to deal with. Poverty is one of them, but and one of them, I mean, again, we got to take this seriously. We have to take seriously the threat that expansionist Islam poses to the world, and there's no doubt that they want to establish a global caliphate. Again, this is fantastic. I don't think that this is going to happen, just through a couple terrorist attacks. But then again, another way that perfectly encapsulates this difference between those on the more realist side and on the American left is, I mean, look at the birth rates. Birth rates are a huge indication of which civilization is going to emerge dominant. And I mean, Western civilization is clearly, no doubt, is clearly in a state of mostly just living off of saved up capital. I mean, it's living. It's failing to convert resources into offspring. In fact, if you look historically, the metrics are clear. Western Europe, putting aside the United States, Western Europe is literally the least efficient civilization ever in terms of its ability to convert resources into offspring, because these are very wealthy societies. They have all their material goods are taken care of. They're very wealthy by historical and by global terms. And I mean, I go there. I've been there many times, and you could look at the birth rates. They're very low there. No one's having kids anymore. No one believes in it anymore. No one believes in it. They don't believe in marriage or monogamy or anything like that. Those are quaint notions. The sanctity is gone. There's no
also the newest socialist principle is abortion on demand, funded by the taxpayers at all times.
That's the most extreme articulation of this idea. That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, that said, I'm not saying that I want to go towards where no abortions are allowed. No. I mean, this is a complicated issue. It's complicated, but yes, that point makes perfect sense there. So this is the perfect way to showcase the difference between realists and academic losers and these Western liberals who know nothing. Is the population of Muslims in around 1950, after World War II, was around 300 million. It's 1.3 billion now. That's a big shift. That's a really big percentage increase. And don't think for a second that doesn't come with all kinds of changes to the global order. It does. It certainly does. We're seeing many of them now. And the funny thing is, I see all the time, I would see Ben Affleck on, I think he said this on Real Time with Bill Maher when he was in that debate with Sam Harris. They keep making this point, like, Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world.
As you say, we have 1.5, 1.6 billion Muslims. Now,
second biggest religion in the world, a quarter.
Well, Ben, let me unpack this. Let me unpack this for you.
Please do.
We have
sitting there packed
just
up.
a minute.
But why are you so hostile about this?
It's gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so nuts.
It's like saying those stateless, shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
And they're just crowing about it. They're so happy to say the fact that they know that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world without thinking for a second about, is this going to cause any problems? Because it's not slowing down.
Well, Nazism was the fastest growing ideology in Germany for quite some time.
Good point.
There's a lot of quickly growing ideologies that turn into genocide and the suppression of human rights.
Exactly, and it's not turning into. That's what it is. That's what's embodied in this book on my table right now. It's stated clearly right there. So yes, it is a threat. So at the same time, one thing that we haven't spent enough time talking about, I think, is, I should talk about American foreign policy at the same time too. I mean, this is really what I study as well. It's not just Iran and Islam in the Middle East. It's also U.S. foreign policy. And we talked about it a little bit. We talked about the supporting Khomeini. We talked about the Iran-Iraq war. And we talked about the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 by the CIA. All this stuff, I will say first, needs to be placed in the post-World War II era. It needs to be placed in a Cold War context if you really want to understand the strategic interests at play here. But we should take very seriously, and I do, we should take very seriously the CIA's concept of blowback too, because you have to. It's not easy. It's not difficult to understand why someone becomes radicalized when their neighbor or their kid is blown up by an errant drone strike that ends up hitting a wedding. I mean, there have been many deaths at the hands of both U.S. foreign policy and Soviet foreign policy and force projection during the Cold War as well. I don't think it. I'm not so naive to think that this is just genocidal mania and that the intention is just to kill people. It's not. There are strategic interests involved too. But look, how much does that matter to someone when your kid dies as a result of it? And that does happen too. And we give, in Iraq, I mean, there were many deaths. It's really difficult to quantify, but we don't need to parse through and say exactly how many there were. I mean, there were a lot of deaths as a result of that invasion that I protested. That was a huge mistake. There was no reason for us to do it. It was totally an idealistic war that could have never been won. So I think we need to have a very realistic foreign policy, one that doesn't seek to export democracy across the world, because inevitably that ends up causing all kinds of problems for us. I think that we want to have rulers in these countries who are ideally, our partners, and I think Iran will be that once we supplant the government there. But make no mistake, I mean, we have contributed to this problem as well.
What I wonder is how much is being done in the Middle East to shift the theocratic paradigm, the religious paradigm, and sort of, I don't know, take people away from this notion of jihad as martyrdom and violence through the spread of religion.
I mean, I think very little is being done. I think very little is being done to do that. I think that's a good goal to have, but I think very little is being done. We did. I just want to talk about the foreign policy and the role that it's played. The group that became Al Qaeda, we supported them. We armed them with Stinger missiles to take down Soviet helicopters when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And as I explained earlier, it wasn't that we supported Al Qaeda, but it's just the case that foreign policy creates odd bedfellows, and it's an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in this case, the much greater enemy was the Soviet Union. At that time, Islamic radicalism was not a concept at all. This was not something we were really dealing with. So, we needed to stop the Soviets from encroaching on Afghanistan and eventually invading Iran and eventually reaching the Persian Gulf. So we did, and it's had blowback as a result of it, because a lot of those fighters, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden included, later formed the group that became Al Qaeda. It plainly happened. Similarly, a lot of the so-called moderate rebels that we supported in Syria and gave them arms to fight off Assad, which we should have never done.
Well, isn't there a conflation in the West by many liberals or leftists or?
I just want to say that those people ended up becoming ISIS. A lot of those arms made its way to ISIS. That was.
But how much foresight could we have had in that regard that would deter us from arming them to fight the like you said, much bigger threat at the time? And also, do you think that there's a conflation from many Western leftists that we are somehow responsible for that in a way that is indicative of malicious intent? I think that's what's too often the mistake here, and intentions matter.
Yeah, this is Sam Harris's big point. Yeah, I don't disagree. I think there are a lot of motivations that go into this also. I mean, you should mention, I do believe that we have a military-industrial complex. Not I believe, I know we have a military-industrial complex that encourages, that helps shape foreign policy. I mean, we spend, if you add everything up, we spend like $680 billion, but if you had everything, we probably spend $1 trillion a year. And a lot of that money is not being spent efficiently. A lot of that money are guys getting contracts from the government. They have their own petty financial interests involved here. And so they are very happy to go to war. It's a war business. We live, to some extent, in a war economy. I would go so far as to reductively say. To some extent, that's true that we do. That said, I wouldn't reduce it all to that. There's definitely strategy at play here, too. I don't think that the Pentagon is so shallow as to just think about how do we help, Lockheed Martin and Boeing's and Raytheon's bottom line. I think there is more to it than that for sure. And I don't think that it's just malicious intent. At the same time, I mean, I don't think that any civilization is just motivated by pure malice. That's not the case in Islam either. I am a huge critic of Islam. But I don't think it's just motivated by pure malice. That's not accurate either. There's reasons why they have these draconian laws. There's reasons why, there's a logic. I don't agree with it, but there's a logic to why they have relegated women to a particular role in society. They are solving the problem of converting resources into offspring, and they have been in that metric more successful than Western civilization has. It's not just. I mean, that's such reductive thinking to say like, they're motivated by malice and we're not. That's a good guys, bad guys thing. I think we can do better than that too. So I don't think the West is, and I don't think Islam is either. I don't think the Chinese are. I think the Chinese are in it for China, essentially. For the Han.
Well, the reductivism you speak of is something that I think is often pervaded from a sense of virtue by Western leftists.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button down below. Leave a comment in the comment section if you can. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.